All right. Well, mahalo, Jim. That was fantastic. What a great talk, from these three panelists. So I now have the prestige and honor to grill you guys on various topics of AI and why neural networks are biased. And no, I'm just kidding. We're going to go through a couple of questions that I jotted down furiously in the back. So to start off, we only have about 20 minutes to go through. So all these individuals will be here, myself as well, on the floor afterwards. So if you guys have specific questions that you want to dive in deeper, highly recommend you come seek us out. Love to chat about any of the topics that we discussed today. So I'm going to start with Farmer Tom, Jeremy. That was a great example of a customer-centric solution. So Jim, I'm going to point the question to you. So in this day and age, of Skynet and the big bad machine, Corteva's focused around the customer-centric solution, and Farmer Tom and the legacy. How has Maui Gem thought about that? The human element of some of these solutions and how AI can apply in that space.
So you're talking about like the privacy aspects of it,
or the privacy, the augmenting workforce, the replacing individuals. Like, how does the human element fit in your designs and your thinking?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the natural extension of what I presented was people say, well, if you can save that much time, let's just eliminate a few jobs and we'll pay for everything in that way. But I think it always comes down to culture, like what's important for the organization. And these tools are like every other tool that we deploy. The hope is that you're empowering people. But I can say that the sort of the concerns about using a device in store is a reality. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, we use iPads and iPhones, and it's been amazing to sort of get feedback from accounts where they would look at an account executive, and if they're on their phone, they immediately think that they're just jacking around, like they're texting right. or something like that. Facebook. Right, but we also deployed iPads, and when they're on iPads, they feel like they're working. So the feedback we got was when we had phones, people were like, hey, why are you like spying on us taking pictures? That was some of the initial response. We don't have the luxury of being out in the middle of a field.
Oh no, we still think people are spying on us.
Okay, all right.
Well, you got that drone going over.
We got the drone going, satellites going everywhere. Everybody's got conspiracy theories.
Yeah, so I think that within our organization, we haven't had that mentality. The bigger concern is always with technology is, how invasive are you to that workforce and what they're doing?
Yeah.
So it's that trade-off of saying, I'm going to give you something really great, but then they're like, but you're really watching what I'm doing. And that's a culture change.
Yeah.
That's a huge culture change.
No, and we see a ton of that, the trust factor of, what are you doing with these types of things? And, to be quite honest, the data shadow and web and mobile have been there for years, right? And we leave this trail, but there's something about this uniqueness, the hype that adds an element to it, right? And through those experiences.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the trust is huge. I mean, we see that problem with our growers even though they're operating the device and using it. If we don't show them the results and how it came about, they're like, oh, this black box just doesn't work for me. I can't trust it. So one of the things we do is really try to be very transparent on what actually are the steps that are doing. I seen on your video there, we actually put red dots on every kernel to show like, hey, this is how we're calculating that, to again build that trust with those growers.
Yeah, I think through the experience building that trust and showing and demonstrating, I think transparency is one of the key things when we think about bias and AI is we as leaders have to demand that transparency, to see what decisions are being made and why they're being made, because I think that's really the important factor of gaining that trust is demanding that transparency. So Benoit, a question for you. We talked a lot about and Farmer Tom out in the field with the ear photometry, but what are you seeing clients with AWS, Advantage, ML at the edge? What are some of the cool case studies or use cases?
Well, I think both of the examples that we heard before,
I know, they're pretty cool.
The drone, your smart glass and the in-store devices, the cameras and those things, those are all the right kind of use cases that we are seeing. In fact, we are seeing, for example, in agriculture, right? I mean, I think some of us have heard about that cucumber farmer example in Japan. So for some reason, we have already always seen that in Japan, they have a natural knack of adopting the technologies, like all the breakthroughs. And that's kind of something that we are also seeing here. So one example is one of our partner, Nomura Research Institute in Japan. They are using it in one of their customers' account, which are a retail store. And that kind of does similar to what you just mentioned in a store, to identify the objects, identify the people's movement. I have also worked with like airports, and not only just for security. So one use case of this thing is just a security. So let's say you have a gated secured community, and then you can have everyone's face in the database, and when it comes in, you can immediately recognize without any delay right on the device that who the person is. So that is one aspect. Another aspect is a little bit more complex than that. In this airport example, so they wanted to look at the traffic pattern that is going on and even identify the emotion in people's faces. This is in Middle East, by the way.
Yeah.
So they have to do a little bit more just to tag any potential risk or security threat that might be brewing among the crowd in the security, which is a much more complex use case, but they were able to run all of that on edge. And then cluster on directly at the airport without sending out data to the cloud, because that is also one of the big requirements for this client because of the data sovereignty requirements. So
Sure.
those are the cases that this comes in really very useful.
That's really interesting. I think about that, and you know, I think these solutions are helping us find information that exists in
Right.
the physical world and
Yeah.
turning it into digital, and really empowering us as, you know, information workers or knowledge workers to be able to capitalize on those elements.
Correct.
So I did have another question, you know, here for you, Jeremy. Thinking about you know, the data that it takes at the edge, and you know, some of the challenges, because I'm sure we have folks sitting in the audience here that say, I've got a ton of data in storage, but I can't tell a story with it, or you know, I can't quite get the image right with the refraction on the lens and those types of things. What advice or challenges did you have, and advice that you would give to the audience around, you know, the data challenges and learning and approaching it? Because as you talked about, you know, some of the ear photometry had been in the labs for so long, and you had already done that, but it's only coming to see the light now. So, you know, what are some of the challenges you had, and what are some of the advice that you would give?
Yeah, some of the challenges we had is again, in agriculture, right, the environment is always changing, whether you're a green background or the corn's dying, whatever. I mean, the environment, sunny, shade, wet corn. I mean, the environment is just chaos at the end of the day. And so it exaggerates basically how much data training sets you have to do. The other thing was just the evolution, right? So the thing was that neural nets and the deep learning models changed over time. I mean, our first vision technology, we could only do yellow corn, and when it was really late stage. And so corn naturally goes through a progression. You know, as soon as it's pollinated, you can see the kernels, but it's basically white. And then it translates and fills with starch, and it changes color. So not only did you have to basically train on shape and size, but we had to train on color. So like even just white corn or Indian corn that has all different colors, we couldn't do that right away. The vision technology couldn't recognize that. So we really had to kind of go back, collect all that data sets. And then the other factor is the cameras keep changing, right? So the phone cameras, they constantly change resolution in that nature. And so
Yes.
what you train on here, all of a sudden the new phone comes out and the model may or may not work because or the sensitivity is completely changed.
Yeah.
And so you constantly have this evolution. And so it just never stop. I guess so the advice, right? Don't give up. You will get thrown roadblocks left and right. And over the decade, honestly, in the last 4 years is really where we made the breakthroughs with the neural nets and the technology, is you got to have a group of individuals in your organization that have huge passion and can see this. I thought the early talk this morning about the man was pretty spot on, because you will face that roadblock in your organization, some, you know, executive or just conflict, whatever, will be like, I don't see the value that that's going to bring. And so you've really got to have, persistent and passion and see the long-term vision, because you're going to get a lot of roadblocks in the short term. Our technology, I showed you about the farmer, but the reality is we use that in research to develop new hybrids. We use that in our supply chain, actually to monitor inventories. So we actually use that same technology in 3 parts of our organization: to develop new products, to manage our inventory, and then to work with growers to help them solve problems. And so we've really been able to move that across the organization.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Jim, anything else to add to that?
As far as building support in an organization?
No, just more so from the challenges that you guys faced in building your models and working through data. And, I know you mentioned about, throwing down Turi Create on your local Mac and having those frustration points. I'm sure all of us who have, been down the path of the promise of AI and it not working. But
look, as a CIO, it's 90% of the job is about ops, right? You got to keep the quarters hitting the bottom of the cup, right? That's what people are looking at, and that's where a lot of the focus ends up going. But to give you context, so Maui Jim is probably the last privately held eyewear company of any size that's not backed by PE. We compete against a company called Groeteke, which recently merged with Essilor. So their market cap, I think, is about $16 billion. We are not $16 billion in revenue. So when we talk about what's going to differentiate a Maui Jim from a Groeteke in the long term, I think that's how I certainly have continued to make the case for cutting edge technology like this, because when you're explaining where the technology gets leveraged to, this is obviously just the first step of where it could exist in the ecosystem, right? So one of the big aspects of the brand experience with Maui Jim is that we'll always take care of a customer. Repairs are one of the largest transactions that we have on our direct-to-consumer website. So imagine if you're able to identify your glasses, as you have them at home, have an AR display where you're marking where the repair should be. So when you have a conversation with a repair tech, you can actually know what it is that you're trying to direct them to. If you think about a selling experience, encapsulating this into an API. So if you're shopping in a store, there are aspects of these lenses that are better for different weather conditions, rose lenses versus bronze lenses versus grayscale. So to be able to tell that story in a retail environment that might be cluttered, when I showed that first display, you could see Maui Jim is just one of maybe 10 displays that are in a Sun specialty store. So how do you make sure that consumer is getting the right story from the salesperson that's sitting on the floor?
Yeah.
So I think it's about having a roadmap, but it's also extremely important to show the quick wins. We all talk about agile. With this, it's really hard to think about having an agile deployment, because you have to get to like a magnitude of work where you can sort of throw it into production. So it's very careful of like who you're going to show it to, because the worst thing is you show it to them and it like bombs completely. Right. And then you got people, we talk about the coconut wireless, which is people just sort of talking in the organization. It's like, you don't want to be on the wrong side of that. You want to make sure your stuff is working before you get it in that audience. So I think it's a combination. It's like having a good roadmap, figuring out how it's going to help you sell stuff. For me, that's important. And then also just making sure you're showing people the right stuff at the right time. Inside a technology staff, people are used to failing early and often. That's the thing we talk about. My CFO doesn't really like those conversations so much, but they're important. So it's a culture of people understanding why it is you're doing and where you're going with it.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. It's kind of a different age. When I think about, we talk about artificial intelligence, it's kind of synonymous with computer science. It's the foundation of how we do these things, and moving in an iterative and agile fashion is constantly improving it. So a model that works in the lab is going to react differently in the field, and as product people, we have to focus on how are we going to continue to improve that model over time or take feedback from that. So Benoit, question to you is, how is Amazon helping customers with that, right? So now that we've got the likes of being able to deploy to the edge and get these models and consuming, how are you helping customers continue to improve their model over time?
Yes. So in Amazon, on AWS, right? So we always try to solve these kind of hard problems for our customers. And you will see that we solve it at very different levels. So I'll take a completely different use case of, let's say, compute infrastructure, right? So as you might know, that one of our first service that came out was EC2 instance. So all it does is it basically takes that desktop under your desk away and put it on a cloud, but then you are still at that point managing that all of the hardware security, software security patches and everything yourself. Now, later we listened to our customer, how can we make it easier for them? Then we started offering services like container management, ECS, EKS, and Fargate. And then we moved on to Lambda, which is even higher at the managed service scale, right? So you will see the same thing we are now doing for the AI ML services. So at the bottom layer, we do provide EC2 type instances, but with a specific image that gives them all the framework that they will ever need, PyTorch, MXNet, TensorFlow, everything. But if they want something that is much more managed, then we give them a service called SageMaker. So with SageMaker, not only we provide them the managed training, so they don't have to worry about actually going and reserving an instance, but the instance is being reserved right at the time when the training is running. So what it does is it reduces the cost of experimentation, right? Like Jim, you were talking about failing early, right? So, and that is super important, especially for startups of your size. And these kind of tools where you can contain your costs, so there is not much sunk cost. You have your data, you bring in your data, you choose an algorithm, and by the way, you also provide 18 different algorithms today, and the number is growing by every month. Where if you want to do object detection, for example, you don't even have to have a data scientist on your staff. So you can be a one-man shop. You can even be like a semi-technical, like a business person, and you will be able to take a ResNet model and train that using the algorithm that we already provide. So that's one. And then at the highest level, we have the fully managed API services like recognition. Like if you think that you want to do a computer vision algorithm, computer vision application, and you can just go with whatever is available off the shelf, right? Like say, just analyzing a street scene and identify the cars and trees, or analyzing even a picture from the drone. You can just use these high-level services, no model training needed. At least you can use these as a proof of concept, and if that works, like as we all know that because of the variability of the real life, ML is always the hardest thing to go. So you can always start with a more abstracted service, and as you gain confidence, you can go down to the value chain and take more and more control on your own hand using our algorithm, and then if you want, you can bring in your own algorithm on the managed training infrastructure.
That's great. That's fantastic. And that full stack, and I've seen it, and it's great for all those different use cases that you talked about. We're coming up on time, so I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds. Your obstacles, your origin, your opportunity in being courageous. Leaving this audience with your final thoughts. These guys are going to go walk back out, experience these things, go back to their jobs. What are the key takeaways that you want them walking away with?
Wow.
Yeah, I was going to say.
In 30 seconds.
In
I'll
30 seconds.
inspire you all in 30 seconds, and I already blew 20 of it. I should say something. It's easy to get started, and so I always tell my teams the distance between 0 and 1 is infinite. So the progress you make from doing nothing to something is always the most exciting step. So I always advocate to people, I'm like, hey, just go from 0 to 1. I'm not asking you to go to 100. So just do something. And I think it just that's the seed, and it grows from there. With the seed, I'm going to hand it over.
I like how you did that. That's fantastic.
Nice. I like that. So yeah, things to walk away. Definitely find those use cases, but don't get hung up on that use case, because to me, the agile side, your use case may modify, right? We started in a research world with our use case, and it morphed and modified into the production side and into the consumer and the grower side. So that will just don't get laser focused, I guess. Keep your eyes open and really try to expand that. But that's one of the key things that I see is don't get focused on the use case too much, because it will morph and change. We live in a dynamic world.
All right. And Vinay?
Well, one thing I'd like to take the audience away from this is well, probably a little bit more on the technical side is the importance of open source. I think I did touch upon briefly during my presentation that how the SageMaker Neo framework is open source. So you do not even have to be on AWS services. You can go get it from a GitHub repository and start playing around with it. So that is one side. And the reason we do that because we think that open source is a value multiplier always. And then on the other side, let's say if you do have a problem and sometimes people struggle with getting the data to train their model.
Yep.
So that is also another area that we are also helping our customer via our open data registry. So go look for open data registry on AWS. And if you have a great idea to, let's say, train a model on satellite imagery, right? It is very hard. It was very hard until now to get a good data set of satellite imagery. You can go to Open Data Registry on AWS. You don't have to pay a dime. You can just download the data onto your local machine or on your EC2 instance or wherever it is you are running, and you will be able to train and deploy a state-of-the-art model within a matter of a couple of hours by yourself. So
Fantastic.
try it out.
Well, again, a warm round of applause for our panelists here.